What if the voice you've been searching for has always been inside you? Not the voice of fear, not the voice of pressure, but the quiet, sacred voice of your soul, calling you home. Carl Jung was not a priest. He was not a preacher. He was a psychiatrist who explored the depths of the human psyche and discovered something radical. The image of God is not found in books or temples. It lives inside the human soul. He believed that healing doesn't begin when life gets easier. It begins when you finally stop and listen to your dreams, to your suffering, to the divine presence inside of you. Jung called this presence the self, the sacred center of your being. It's not imagination, it's not fantasy, it's the part of you that never gave up, even when you did. And when you reconnect with that inner presence, something shifts. You stop chasing approval, you stop fearing stillness. You begin to live with purpose, not performance. If this message is awakening something within you, I invite you to go deeper. I've written a powerful healing guide based on Carl Jung's wisdom, designed to help you understand your emotional patterns, heal unconscious wounds, reconnect with your inner truth, and return to the divine center that never left you. It's available in the pinned comment below, a tool to support your transformation. Now, take a breath. And remember, the journey back to yourself is also the journey back to God. We live in a world where it's easier to distract than to feel, where many chase success but feel empty, perform well but sleep in silence, smile in public while grieving in private. But Carl Jung, a scientist of the soul, saw through the noise. He believed that what most people are truly missing isn't motivation or direction or success. It's connection to themselves and to the divine spark buried deep within. Jung spent decades listening to people who had everything: careers, families, recognition, and yet felt lost. They didn't know why they cried when they were alone. They didn't know why anxiety lived beneath every achievement. They didn't know why their hearts ached, even when nothing was wrong. And Jung traced it back to one thing: the disconnection between the ego and the self. Not the ego. That smiles for the camera. Not the image you post or the title you carry, but the self, the sacred center of the soul. The part of you that is untouched by fear, unshaken by external chaos, and deeply rooted in divine truth. Jung believed this self is where God lives within us, not as a concept or doctrine, but as a quiet presence. One that reveals itself when the noise fades. One that waits patiently until we finally come home to ourselves. And that's what this message is about. Not theology, not religion, but the experience of God as a living force inside your deepest being. If that resonates with you, if you've ever felt like something inside is trying to speak, then you're in the right place. You don't need to understand everything. Right now, you just need to be willing to listen. If this message already touches something within you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. We explore inner transformation, deep healing, and the wisdom of Carl Jung, all through the lens of soul and spirit. Now, take a breath, let the noise fade, and prepare to meet the God within. The self. Where the human and the divine meet. Carl Jung believed that the deepest part of you, the self, is not a metaphor or a spiritual abstraction. It is the central force of your being, the silent witness behind every experience, and the inner space where the human and the divine converge. To Jung, the self wasn't a theory. It was a presence. He saw it in dreams. He saw it in breakdowns. He saw it in people who had reached the end of everything they understood and suddenly began to wake up. The self isn't something you create. It's something you return to. It has always been there, waiting behind the noise, behind the roles you play, behind the image you perform. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It waits. Most of us spend years living in the surface layers of life, surviving routines, managing emotions, chasing expectations. We learn how to behave. We learn how to appear strong, but we rarely learn how to go inward. And yet the symptoms begin to appear. Anxiety with no cause, success that feels hollow, a quiet ache you can't explain. Jung saw these not as malfunctions, but as messages from the self, the sacred part of you that refuses to be silenced, the part of you that knows you're out of alignment, even when your calendar is full and your photos look perfect. He believed that every soul carries an inner image of God, conscious or unconscious. And when that image becomes distorted by fear, trauma, or shame, it doesn't just affect your beliefs. It shakes your entire emotional structure. It alters how you see yourself, how you love, how you trust, and how you suffer. For some, God becomes judgment. For others, God becomes absence. But Jung discovered something radical. When your internal image of the divine is damaged, your inner world becomes unstable. But when that image begins to heal, the soul starts to bloom. This healing doesn't come from doctrines. It doesn't arrive through forced positivity. It comes through experience, raw, personal, and often uncomfortable, through silence, through confrontation, through deep inner truth. Jung called it individuation, the sacred journey of becoming who you were meant to be, beneath all the masks. Individuation isn't about becoming someone better. It's about becoming someone real. And to do that, you must face the parts of yourself you've abandoned, the child within you who was taught to be quiet, the teenager who learned that vulnerability was weakness, the adult who learned to function, but forgot how to feel. The self, the divine center, doesn't emerge through perfection. It emerges through wholeness. And wholeness requires integration, not suppression. It means embracing your light, but also acknowledging your darkness. Not glorifying it, but understanding it. Because the pain you ignore becomes the voice that controls you. And the shame you hide becomes the pattern that repeats itself. In relationships, in silence, in choices you don't understand but keep making. Jung believed that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will rule your life. And you will call it fate. So many people walk through life reacting to their past, to their projections, to old wounds they never even knew they carried. They blame the world for what was actually written long ago inside them, by fear, by rejection, by abandonment. But healing begins when you stop blaming and start listening. When you ask, what part of me have I abandoned in order to survive? What dream did I bury to be accepted? What voice inside me have I silenced? And what is it trying to say now? The self is not a concept, it's a compass. It's the still center you forgot existed, the one that was always trying to lead you home. And God. Not a skybound observer, but a presence within that self, the deepest whisper in your soul, the part that still believes in healing, even when your ego says it's too late. To Jung, the divine was not distant. It was woven into the architecture of the psyche. It spoke through symbols. It appeared in dreams. It revealed itself through patterns, through loss, through love, and sometimes through collapse. Because sometimes we must fall apart to hear the voice we've ignored for too long, not to be punished, but to be recalled, to be brought back to the truth that God never left, that your soul has never stopped speaking, that healing is possible, and it begins not with answers, but with surrender. And maybe that's why you're here. When everything breaks. The silence. Where God speaks, there comes a point in every soul's journey when the surface begins to crack. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something inside you is finally trying to wake up. Jung believed that the encounter with the self often begins with a collapse, not a gentle nudge but a breakdown, when what once gave you certainty suddenly doesn't make sense, when your routines feel hollow, when your mind can't solve what your heart is silently screaming. This collapse isn't the end, it's the threshold. It's the moment when the ego, the part of you that tries to control, impress, and protect, finally gets quiet enough for the soul to speak. And what does it say? It whispers truths you've tried to avoid. It brings up pain you've buried for years. It shows you the mask you've worn so long you forgot it was a mask. To Jung, this collapse was sacred, because it was not destruction for punishment, but disruption for transformation. When the false self begins to fall apart, the true self begins to emerge, not polished, not perfect, but real. This is when the shadow appears. Jung called the shadow the hidden twin of the psyche, all the parts of yourself you rejected, denied, or repressed. It's not evil. It's everything you thought wasn't allowed. Your sadness, your rage, your need to cry, your need to be loved, your guilt, your desire, your grief. And here's the truth Jung discovered. What we refuse to see in ourselves becomes what we hate in others. We project our shadow onto the world, judging, blaming, controlling, not because we're strong, but because we're afraid to face our own reflection. Healing begins when we stop running. When we stop trying to be perfect, when we stop labeling pain as weakness, and instead we sit with it, we listen, we ask, "What are you here to show me?" Jung didn't romanticize suffering, but he respected it, because he knew that the soul often speaks clearest through the wound, that in our most vulnerable moments we are closest to what is most eternal. That's why so many people meet God not in the light, but in the dark, in the silence after the breakdown, in the stillness that follows the storm, when the prayers don't get answered, when the identity you built starts to dissolve, when you don't know what comes next, but you're finally too tired to pretend. It's here, in this place of unknowing, that something begins to shift, not because you figured everything out, but because you finally stopped trying to control it all. Jung once said, "The experience of God begins where certainty ends." This is the silence of the divine, not absence, but space. God doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes he speaks by removing everything that's been distracting you from yourself. The friendships that fell apart, the plans that didn't work out, the breakdown you couldn't stop, the grief that cracked something inside you open. Each moment, an invitation. Each collapse, a clearing, each silence, a place for something new to grow. But not everyone accepts that invitation. The ego resists. It says, "This can't be right. This pain must mean I failed. God must have abandoned me." But the soul knows better. The soul remembers what the mind forgets. That pain can be a passage. That surrender can be sacred. That there is wisdom in the dark if you dare to stay long enough to see it. And maybe you're here not by accident, but because your own shadow is stirring. Maybe life hasn't made sense lately. Maybe what once lit you up now leaves you numb. Maybe you've been asking where God went, and maybe he never left. Maybe he's been speaking the whole time, through the ache in your chest, the tension in your body, the longing you can't explain. Not to punish you, but to lead you inward. Jung believed that real spirituality doesn't bypass suffering. It transforms it. The ego wants relief, but the soul wants truth, and the truth is you are not broken. You are being dismantled, so that what is eternal in you can finally take root, so that the God within you can stop whispering and begin leading. And when that happens, you don't return to who you were. You become someone entirely new. Not because life got easier, but because you got aligned with your truth, with your voice, with the self, with God. The return. From fear to presence, from ego to God. There's a moment, after the silence, after the collapse, after the shadow has been faced, when something within you shifts, not because your problems disappeared, not because everything makes sense, but because you're no longer living from the surface. You begin to feel differently. You speak with more intention. You say no when something violates your peace. You say yes when your soul whispers, even if your mind still hesitates. This is the beginning of alignment, the beginning of living with the self at the center, and not the ego. Carl Jung didn't teach spiritual escape. He taught spiritual embodiment. He believed that once you reconnect with the divine within, life doesn't get easier. It gets realer. You stop chasing illusions. You stop pretending to be who others want. You stop searching for God in external systems because you realize He's already been walking with you, as you. This is not arrogance. It's not self-deification. It's sacred humility. Because when you live from the self, you don't feel superior. You feel connected to others, to truth, to something bigger than yourself that flows through everything. And suddenly you see the patterns. You recognize that certain relationships kept you small, that certain jobs drained your soul, that certain behaviors were rooted in fear, not freedom. And without force, without drama, you begin to release them. You choose peace over performance. You choose solitude over noise. You choose purpose over approval. You begin to feel guided, not by logic alone, but by intuition, resonance, and inner clarity. You wake up in the morning and feel presence, not because everything is perfect, but because you know who you are and who is living in you. This is what Jung called integration. It's when your ego no longer needs to fight your soul. It's when your shadow is no longer denied, but understood. It's when your divine center becomes your compass, and when that happens, you become dangerously peaceful. People feel it. Your energy changes. Your voice carries weight, not because it's loud, but because it's aligned. You don't need to argue to prove your worth. You don't need to rush to stay relevant. You don't need to explain your choices to those who can't hear the voice that guides you. You become steady, still, certain, not in outcome, but in identity. This doesn't mean you no longer feel pain. It means your pain is no longer your master. It becomes your teacher. You don't run from discomfort. You sit with it and ask it what it's here to show you. You don't seek constant stimulation. You seek meaning. You don't live for validation. You live in truth, and in truth there is peace. And this peace isn't fragile. It's not shaken by criticism. It's not destroyed by change. It's not stolen by rejection. Because it's not built on the world. It's built on what's eternal inside you. Jung believed that the self, when fully awakened, begins to lead your entire life. It influences your relationships, your work, your creativity, your health, your time. You stop asking, what should I do to be loved? And start asking, what honors my truth? This is the God within, not performing miracles outside of you, but working miracles within, changing how you see, how you feel, how you forgive, how you return to yourself when you forget again, because you will forget. That's part of being human. But when the self is alive in you, you always find your way back through silence, through stillness, through that sacred feeling that says, this is right, this is real, this is who I am. You stop being reactive. You become responsive, and your entire presence becomes medicine. People will ask you what changed. They'll sense the depth in your eyes. They'll feel the groundedness in your energy. And the truth is, what changed wasn't your life. It was your center. You stopped living from fear. You started listening to God. You stopped reaching for love. You started becoming it. You stopped waiting for peace. You realized peace had been waiting for you. Jung said that a person who is truly integrated can transform a room without speaking a word, because their very presence transmits something rare. Wholeness, not perfection, wholeness. A life not lived to impress but to embody. A soul not shaped by trauma but healed through truth. And maybe that's what you're becoming now. Not someone new, but someone finally real. Someone who walks not just with a belief in God, but with the awareness that God has been walking within you the entire time. Becoming whole. When God moves through you, there's a difference between believing in something and becoming a living expression of it. Carl Jung understood this. He didn't want people to memorize truths. He wanted them to embody them. Because when God lives within you, not as a concept but as a living force, everything begins to change, not all at once, not with fireworks, but in quiet, powerful ways. You notice your reactions shift. You no longer explode in fear. You pause. You breathe. You ask your soul, not your ego, for direction. You notice how your presence affects people. You no longer rush to fix or impress. You sit, you listen, you hold space, not because you're trained to, but because you've been transformed. This is what happens when the self leads. It doesn't demand attention. It radiates quiet authority. It doesn't manipulate outcomes. It aligns with the truth and trusts the unfolding. And that truth starts to infuse your choices. You no longer ask, how do I look? You ask, is this aligned? You no longer chase relationships that entertain your loneliness. You welcome relationships that honor your soul. You don't chase meaning outside of you. You bring meaning into everything you touch, because the meaning is inside you. This is the miracle of integration, where your ego, shadow, inner child, wounds, gifts, dreams, and desires all come into the light. not to be destroyed but to be reconciled. Jung believed that the goal of life is not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness is when the God within you becomes the compass of your life, when your inner world stops conflicting and starts cooperating. That's when clarity comes, not because life becomes simple, but because you are no longer split inside. You stop second-guessing yourself. You stop living one way and believing another. You stop running from the voice inside that's always known. You return to coherence, to congruence, to sacred inner order. This is what Jung saw in his clients over and over, men and women who had reached success but were haunted, people who had done everything right but felt like something essential was missing. Because what was missing wasn't love, wasn't money, wasn't success. What was missing was alignment with the self, with the part of them where God was still waiting. And once they remembered that place, they began to live differently. Not perfectly, but purposefully. They began to forgive, not just others, but themselves. They began to choose, not from fear, but from wisdom. They began to speak, not to be heard, but to reveal what is. True, that's when spirituality becomes real. It's not a ritual, it's not performance. It's a way of being. You live slowly. You feel deeply. You listen before reacting. You wait for clarity instead of forcing outcomes. And people will notice. They'll say, "You're different. You seem calmer. You feel grounded." What changed? And you won't always have the words to explain, because what changed wasn't just your mindset, and it was your foundation. You stopped building your life from the outside in. You started building it from the inside out, from a place where God and soul speak the same language. And when you live from that place, even your pain transforms. You no longer see your wounds as shameful. You see them as sacred. You don't erase your past. You reclaim it. You see how the darkness shaped your light. You see how the silence taught you to listen. You see how the shadow shaped your integrity, and how the collapse brought you home. To Jung, this is the true spiritual awakening. It's not fire from heaven, it's fire from within. Quiet, persistent, unshakable. And when that fire is alive in you, you don't just believe in God. You become someone through whom God flows, in your presence, in your silence, in your work, in your love. In the way you look at someone and see who they are beneath their defenses, because you've seen who you are beneath yours. You don't try to be good, you become whole, and wholeness is goodness with depth, not shallow, not performative, but rooted. People feel safe around you, not because you're perfect, but because you're present. And in a world addicted to performance, presence is revolutionary. That's why this path matters. That's why healing matters, not just for you, but for the world that meets you. Because every soul that chooses to awaken makes the world just a little more awake. Every person who listens inward helps silence the noise outward. Every individual who walks in alignment becomes a lighthouse for those still lost in their storms. So if you've made it this far, something in you is waking up. And maybe now you understand that the God you've been searching for was never missing. He was within you all along, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be heard, waiting to move through you, as you. The voice that never left you. You've come a long way, and not just through this message, but through your own inner journey. And maybe right now, something in you feels quiet, still, but not empty. That's not coincidence. That's the voice of the self, the God within, beginning to speak louder than your fear. Carl Jung believed that healing doesn't begin when things make sense. It begins when you choose to stop running, when you stop avoiding silence, when you stop chasing the world and start listening inward. This is not about becoming someone new, it's about remembering who you were before the noise, before the masks, before the pain. The real miracle isn't that God speaks. The miracle is that He never stopped. He speaks in your longing, in your breakdown, in your ache for something more. He speaks in the stillness after your last breakdown, and the peace that somehow followed. And maybe today all He wants is for you to pause and whisper back, "I hear you." Because that moment, that tiny moment of surrender, can change everything. You don't need to fix your whole life overnight. You just need to begin, and you already have. If this message spoke to you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, not for numbers, but to keep walking this path together. This is a space for truth, healing, and remembering the divine within you. And if you're ready to go deeper, I've created a special healing guide based on the wisdom of Carl Jung to help you understand your emotional patterns, reconnect with your inner voice, and return to the self, the part of you that has always been whole. You'll find the link in the pinned comment below. It was written with care for souls like yours. Now take a breath and let these final words echo where they matter most. You were never broken. You were always becoming whole, and God never left.